Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Natalie Pereira. I'm the Chief Executive of the Education Policy Institute. I'm sure many of you tuned in today will have heard of EPI and our work, but in case you are new to us, we're an independent charity. Our aim is to improve outcomes for all children and young people, but particularly to close the gap between the most disadvantaged and the rest. And we do that through producing a programme of high quality, rigorous research that casts a light on what's working and what isn't working to improve outcomes and close the gap. And also through convening important events like this afternoon's webinar to disseminate the challenges and potential solutions in achieving our mission. I'm really delighted that we're able to offer this webinar today in partnership with the OECD and with the Royal Society. So today we will be looking in detail at the OECD's Programme for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, or PIAAC. PIAAC assessed skills and literacy, numeracy and adaptive problem solving in 16 to 65-year-olds across 31 countries and economies. And today we'll be looking at the latest PIAAC report, which was published in December 2024. And we'll be looking particularly at the findings that relate to younger people, so 16 to 24-year-olds, and what that means for education policy here in the UK. In a moment, we'll hear from Andreas Schleicher, who many of you will know. He is the Director for Education and Skills in the OECD. He'll be taking us through the main findings from the latest PIAAC report, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to him directly. And then after Andreas's presentation, we'll be hearing from an expert panel. They will set out their reflections on the findings, what they mean for policy. And then again, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions to our wider panel too. So if and when you do have questions, as Helen said, please pop them in the Q&A function that should be on your screen. But first of all, I'm delighted to introduce one of our event partners today, Professor Dame Athene Donald, who is a fellow at the Royal Society. And a very warm welcome from us at EPI, Dame Athene, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to EPI for hosting today and inviting me and the Royal Society to take part in the webinar. And of course, to Andreas and his team at the OECD for carrying out this work and being here today to discuss the findings. Let me give you a bit of background. The Royal Society is the UK's National Academy of Science. It's the oldest continuously existing scientific institution in the world. It was founded back in 1660. And one of the Society's core principles is to promote excellence in science for the benefit of humanity. And this applies just as much to the Society's education policy work as well. The Society works to create an education system which benefits all young people, which encourages breadth of study and critical thinking, and which provides opportunities for young people to progress into careers which will contribute to the UK's scientific future, as well as other sectors. As a fellow of the Royal Society and a former chair of its education committee, I have a particular interest in science, mathematics, and computing education. And the findings from the OECD Adult Competencies Survey have implications for these subjects, as well as the education system as a whole. For a number of years now, and certainly since the time I chaired their education committee, which was back between 2010 and 14, the Royal Society has been advocating for changes to the education system at a structural level. It believes that the current system simply doesn't work for all students, and that significant reforms are needed in order to provide an education that truly prepares young people for their future choices. The world is hugely changed from the last time we had significant systemic education reform. GCSEs were introduced in the 1980s and A-levels way back in the 1950s. In many ways, the world as it was when these reforms were made is totally unrecognisable. And this in itself might provide a reasonable basis for assuming it was time to make big changes to the education system. And a lot of things have changed. Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, and the rapidly changing face of technology and AI have all shown that we need an education system that provides flexibility as well as knowledge, that allows foundational learning across as broad a range of disciplines as possible, rather than a narrow system that cuts off routes and subject options from seemingly younger and younger years. Reforms in education tend to focus on the tangibles of curriculum and assessment, but I would say we should be asking the question, what is the purpose of education? The education system should be designed around ensuring it provides the skills, knowledge, and experiences that young people actually need by the time they leave school or college, and that moves with the times, and so should the system. We also need to design a system where teachers are given the necessary agency, autonomy, and creative freedom they need to be able to teach and support young people as best they can, without weighing them down under an accountability system and other measures which take up their valuable time. This was spelt out very clearly back in the report the Royal Society produced a decade ago, looking at a vision for the future of STEM education. Following last year's general election, the new Labour government set out quite quickly that education was a priority area for them, announcing over the summer that they'd launch the Curriculum and Assessment Review in the autumn, and it would be led by Professor Becky Francis. While it was good to see a focus on education, the remit set out by the review itself was, it seems, rather unambitious. Our view was that in order to have a meaningful impact, the review should steer away from making tweaks and changes to things like curriculum content of individual subjects, and should instead consider the system as a whole, thinking beyond this parliamentary term. It's clear that for some students, the education system as it is works well. These students tend to be the ones following very traditionally academic education paths, succeeding in GCSEs and A-levels and pursuing a degree at universities. For the students who don't fit into this particular pathway, their experience of the system can be quite different. For example, if we look at the current GCSE maths qualification, in 2024, just 60% of students taking maths GCSE achieved a passing grade of 4. That leaves well over a third of students who didn't reach a passing grade and who under current government policy are required to continue studying GCSE in their post-16 education. Pass rates for those who then resit those GCSE maths are incredibly low, and notably lower than pass rates for English resits. This is an example of a current piece of policy which doesn't serve young people well, and one we hope the curriculum review will seek to reform in its report. More generally, whilst we can recognise and celebrate that there are great improvements that have been made in numeracy and literacy across the last decade, as shown by the current survey scores, we also need to acknowledge that there are still many issues that need to be addressed within the compulsory education system in order to better prepare those leaving school and college for the world of work, further study, or other pursuits. Mathematical and data skills are central to computing and are essential for a wide range of sectors, including quantum, finance, cybersecurity, manufacturing, renewable energy, engineering, creative industries, and health, to name just a few. But the education system is falling behind our international counterparts. The study shows that over 8 million working-age adults have low proficiency in literacy, numeracy, or both. Data from this round of the survey suggests that 21% of English adults tested scored at a level below primary school proficiency in numeracy, compared to the OECD average of 16.3%. These numbers are very troubling, and they expose a particular need for mathematical and data education reform in this country. The Royal Society published their report, A New Approach to Mathematics and Data Education, late last year, which set out the need for maths education to integrate data statistics and use of digital and computer tools to better prepare young people for the workplace and life after compulsory schooling. It's our hope at the Royal Society that the Independent Curriculum and Assessment Review will reflect on the recommendations from this report, as well as the findings from the PIAAC, as they produce their interim and final reports to government. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing the presentation now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Damathene. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Andrea Schleicher, who will take us through the key findings. Don't forget, if you do have questions, please do pop them into the Q&A function. And Andreas, over to you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. It's always great to work with you, and I look forward to our discussion on this survey, which is in fact quite unique. You know, we know a lot about the degrees and qualifications that people have, but actually that tells us only so much about what people know and actually can do. And this survey really is the first survey that looked, or the second wave of the first survey that looked directly at the skills of people, that tested the capacities of people in a direct way. And you're going to see qualifications are sometimes not even a great proxy, because some people continue to learn after they get their degrees and qualifications, and also because qualifications that have the same name may have very different value in terms of the knowledge and skills they provide. So that's the idea of the survey, to get a direct perspective on those outcomes. We focused on three areas that we felt were of particularly important. The first is really the foundations, people being able to access, manage, reflect, critically think about what they see in front of them. That's the notion of literacy underpinning this survey. People's capacity to think quantitatively, to understand the value of numbers and how they're going to use them, and then solving problems in a complex digital world. Really, this idea of adaptive problem solving also is something that we felt is important. But I know you're waiting for the results, so let me start with this. And here you can see a list of the results. On the left side, you can see the countries ranked by their performance on the survey. You can see countries in Northern Europe coming out on top. In the middle, you find countries like Germany, Ireland, Czechia, New Zealand, the US, and at the end of the list, Israel, Lithuania, Poland, Portugal, and Chile. So that's the overall rank order. And England comes out in the kind of upper group of countries as well. What is concerning and to some extent surprising was the large share of adults without even the most basic levels of foundation literacy. And what you see here in the green bars, the two segments, is basically adults who struggle with the literacy skills you would expect from a 10-year-old child in Britain. Basically, looking at a simple text, extracting, a word, things like this that are really very elementary. And you can see that, we have, 1 in 5 people in England who struggle with those things. And that's, I think, quite a significant number. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, of course, there are adults who have very advanced information management skills. In yellow, for example, you can see people at level 4, who can, contrast, critique, build a complex mental representation of information, all of those things that, are at the high end of the skill distribution. But really, I think the large share of very low performer should, give us to think, where do things go wrong? Normally, where countries are doing well on literacy, they're also doing well on numeracy, but there are some interesting exceptions. Now, you can see, for example, a country like Singapore, people do a better job with numbers. In the case of the UK, literacy works better than the numeracy skills. So there's few variations on that, but not that many. Overall, I think we can say it's quite consistent now. We did the survey already a decade ago, so we can see how things have changed since then. And you see that here in literacy, only Finland and Denmark saw measurable improvements over the last 10 years. While there's a whole group of countries here on the right side with sometimes sharp declines. And I say this because clearly our environment is becoming much more demanding on the skills of people. But you see that not reflected in their knowledge and skills, and their capacity to process information. Some countries did this assessment already in 2015 or 17. Here you can also see a downward trend there. Now, in some countries, the composition of the population has changed, for example, in terms of age or immigrant background. But, you know, when you account for that, for most countries like England, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Exceptions are Sweden, Norway, and Korea, where you can say, look, you know, if you would account for people with an immigrant background who had tended to be more on the lower end of the distribution, they would also see a kind of more positive trend. But, you know, overall, what you see here is real. It's not an artifact of, you know, changes in the composition of population. What's also interesting is that the changes that we see here are not reflected in numeracy, which really shows that it's particularly our capacity to access, manage, integrate, reflect on information that seems to be suffering. And certainly, you know, the digital world will have something to do with this. You know, if you ask yourself, you know, 10 years ago, probably you read more complex texts, you did more complex analysis, you had, you know, more time to engage with conflicting perspectives and viewpoints. Now in the digital world, we get everything, you know, pre-digested for us and so on. So probably that's, you know, at least part of the explanation. But certainly it's not demography, it's not migration in most countries. What we've also seen is that the socioeconomic gap in literacy proficiency has widened, particularly in countries here, you know, Estonia, Austria, Germany. You can see people at the, you know, privileged kind of groups have done better. People at the, you know, more disadvantaged groups were the ones who dragged performance down. And again, you can see even after accounting for immigrant background and demographics, you see that increases in social disparity are actually quite prevalent. Not in England, though. I think that's a good part. You know, it's been pretty stable in England. I already mentioned in numeracy changes have been more favorable. You can see England actually among the countries where things have improved. As I said before, numbers were never the strengths in England, but you could see certainly in the young population, we've seen improvements driving things upward. If you look at this in the long run, you can see that youth generally have much higher literacy skills than, you know, older generations, whose performance you can see here in the purple square. And it's not so much a surprise, you know, who enters the labor market today generally got a much better educational opportunity than those who leave for retirement. So not much of a surprise. But what is, I think, surprising is how much those intergenerational differences vary across countries. Look at the United States. You know, the older generation has much better literacy skills than the OECD average. You can compare that here with the dotted line. But when you look at the literacy skills of young Americans, they fall clearly behind the OECD average. And that's not because, you know, their skills have declined, but because so many other countries have seen faster improvement across generations. England also has relatively limited intergenerational progress. Singapore is the opposite. You know, you can see the older generation in Singapore does much worse than older Brits, but young Singaporeans outperform young Brits. Let me also point to Chile. That was the last country on the list, but you can see there actually young people have made progress. So you can see some countries have dramatically changed their relative position. Singapore used to be ranked 25, now is 5. You have the United States that used to be ranked 10 and is now 20, or New Zealand that was number 5 and is now 22. So what you can see here nicely is that, you know, those things are not written in stone. Some countries that have been traditionally very successful in, you know, equipping people with the skills they need have fallen behind. Other countries have risen. When you add the group in the middle here in light blue, you can see some interesting nuance. You know, there's a group of countries where adults keep building literacy skills. This idea of lifelong, life-wide learning is taking hold. For example, Finland, Estonia, Belgium, Denmark, New Zealand are really good examples. But there are not so many. We all talk about lifelong learning, but it's more a lifelong talk than actually lifelong learning, as you can see here. Actually, in very few countries do we see people expanding their kind of literacy skills. Let me focus a bit more on education. Here you can see that people with more advanced qualification, university degree or advanced vocational qualification, do generally quite well on the survey of adult skills. But look how widely the skills of university graduates differ across countries. And then, of course, everywhere college graduates do much better than adults who only completed high school, or, not even that. But even that, gap between different qualifications varies hugely across countries. Now, you can see here how Finnish high school graduates have better or similar literacy skills than university graduates in England. Think about it. In Finland, they've just completed their high school and they come out as well as people who complete university or college in the case of England. And actually on the right side, you see many countries where they actually do better than that. So I think let's, keep that in mind that, qualifications are important, but they only tell you so much about what people know and can do. We should, get a more realistic appreciation of them and not see them become barriers to people's success. I'm going to talk about this at the end. Immigration, is clearly another factor. You can see in most countries, foreign-born adults score markedly lower than native-born adults, even though Britain is an interesting example. In Britain, yes, there is a visible performance gap, but actually it is quite small. And, once you account for demographics and social background, it actually shrinks even further. What's also interesting, this is the first generation of immigrants, people who've just come into the country. This is the second generation. And there you can see actually in the second generation, we no longer see that performance disadvantage. In Ireland, in Canada, in Israel, actually the children of immigrants do better than their native counterparts. So I believe it shows that actually our countries generally are capable of integrating people. In the second generation, pretty much the performance disadvantage has disappeared in most countries, not everywhere, but it becomes certainly, not as large as what we see when we look at gender or social background or other things. Last but not least, now that we have examined the skills, let's see what difference they make for the lives of people. Now, the first thing, as you would expect, the skills explain a big part of the salary that you're going to see. That's what your employer pays you for. Education adds over and above of that. But if you look at England, for example, England's labor market is very skill sensitive. If you have great skills, you get a good salary. If you have poor skills, you get penalized for that. Education is, of course, much broader. You need to add to this then, what you study matters, but not as much as you think. You can't say, well, someone who studies anthropology will always earn less than an engineer. Yeah, there's a bit of a difference, but not as much as you might think. Then, how long you have been in the job, but in England, that doesn't matter very much. And then come individual characteristics. That's a mixed bag of lots of things. So you can see actually, when you look at your salary, a big part of that is what you know, what you can do, and the broader education that you've got. So it's also interesting to look at this in a historical perspective. What you can see that the red bar, which is about what we see now, and the blue bar, which is what we saw a decade ago, are often quite different. In most countries, the red bar is longer, which means that if you have great skills, you get an even better salary than you used to get 10 years ago. Whereas if you have poor skills, you get a lower skill. So our economies, our societies tend to polarize the impact of skills. So the wage distribution is, pulled on both sides based on the skills that people have, at least a lot more than it was the case 10 years ago. And I do think that is a concern, because it means even if the skill distribution doesn't get worse, the impact of that distribution on on earnings is going to rise. And it's not just about money. You can see very clearly that, more highly skilled people also are happier with their lives. We can see lots of really interesting social outcomes as well. I show you just a few examples of here. Trust in our societies is clearly associated with the skills of people, even more so than political efficacy. That's also interesting. People who have the right skills, see themselves as actors in their societies. People who have poor skills, who do not really understand, the environment in which they operate, often have a much lower sense of political efficacy. But trust, same picture. Now, trust has a lot to do with to what extent you understand, access the world around you. And again, that relates to your basic skills. Overqualification, that's an interesting finding, that England is actually the country with the largest share of people who have better qualifications than what they need for their job, but not always better skills. That's so interesting. You have actually plenty of people who are overqualified and underskilled, which really tells us that we should, become much better in recognizing the skills of people and, become more nuanced in, penalizing people who may not have got the right certificate. And of course, overqualification has a price that is very clear, where basically you are not well matched to your job. Your employer is only going to pay you for what your qualification is. And that means often a wage penalty. In the average, it's 12% in the UK is more. That's all what I wanted to share with you by introduction. I look very much forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andreas. Fascinating as ever. And some key themes really stood out, I think. Right. A couple of questions on the, well, one question at the moment coming in from the audience. Is the data relating to England only, or are the other UK nations included?
Unfortunately, we only have data for England this time. That's why I highlighted it. We don't have data for Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and so on.
Great, thank you. And a reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A tab. There is one that's come through to the chat asking whether you looked at soft skills in the PIAAC study.
Absolutely, and we're going to publish this later this year in November. Actually, we have for the first time also looked at a whole range of workplace skills, soft skills, and we're currently analyzing those kinds of findings.
That's great. We look forward to that, and do let us know when that's out. A question from Mary. Please, could you unpack a bit more the overqualified but underskilled findings in England? I thought they were fascinating too, if you could say a bit more.
Yeah, it's often people, basically overqualification means that you have higher qualifications than what someone would need to get your job. So there are a lot of people in England who have, studied in a college and have maybe a non-college job, but sometimes, their skill levels are not higher than what they need for their job, or even lower. So and your employer is only going to pay you for the skills that actually you demonstrate at the workplace. And that's really, I think that's the overqualification. We should not read too much into this. Yes, those people have, maybe better qualifications than what they need, but if they don't have the skills that they need, or not more of the skills, then, it's much less of an issue than it seems. But it's a concern actually that, qualifications often get into the way of people being allocated to the right job at the right place.
Thank you. And just keeping with that theme, I know that you said we shouldn't be overly distracted by it, but there's a really interesting question here from Kieran. So in England, we know that about 50% of our population goes to university. Do you think that is resulting in an overly qualified population? And then at the other, well, not quite at the other end, but we also have a relatively low number of adults studying at level 4 and 5, so to sub-degree qualifications. Do you think that these trends are driving some of your findings?
You know, it's so interesting. You have seen this huge increase in degree holders in Britain, but the skills of people have remained essentially flat. Now, if you look at the PIAAC data, we have seen more or less the same skill distribution that we saw, a decade ago. And that really means that, sometimes people at the margins who are getting degrees now, who wouldn't have got a degree a decade ago, university may not be perhaps the best place for them to acquire skills. And countries that have a greater variety of possibilities to acquire skills are often in a better position. I think that's something that I would say you can derive from this data. These are not, the data do not track individuals, but you can very clearly see that the expansion in formal qualifications in Britain has not led to an equivalent increase in the skills of people. So that's, again, there may be an inflation of, degrees and qualifications that isn't borne out by actual value in terms of at least the skills that we measured here.
Thank you. And then just one final question on this before I move us on to some other themes. So how have you measured the skills needed by employers in looking at over and underqualified levels?
It's a very good question. There are two ways how we looked at that. We ask employers, but for that, for example, we don't have data for Britain. But the more interesting ways is actually, employers are often not that great in telling you about the skills that they actually need. And it's actually very, very difficult. The best proxy that we have is we actually look at how people deploy their skills. So we create a kind of profile of, different skill component, and then we ask people questions about the level and intensity of the skills which they use at the workplace. And the assumption is, what you use is actually needed. And for us, that has become the most reliable predictor of current skill needs, looking at effective utilization of different skill components. But, people argue with this. When you ask employers, sometimes you get a very different picture, but I tend to trust more what people actually do than what some people say they need.
Yeah. Right. There's a question here from Kat on the curriculum and assessment review, which you mentioned. And Kat asks whether any of this data has been passed on to Professor Becky Francis and her team. Now, you may be able to answer, Andreas, from an OECD perspective, but we do also have a DFE representative on our panel later, so we can ask him too.
Yeah, I'm sure they know better than me.
Great. And I'll move us on now to another question. They're anonymous, but they ask, they say they're surprised at how little field of study impacts wages. Please, could you provide more detail on the analysis and findings here?
Yeah, that was interesting to us as well, but it does show, that if you study art, you may not just become an artist, which probably is not so much associated with great income, but you may end up in a very innovative kind of profession. I do think actually it shows that many different fields of study can lead to success. Now, sometimes the variance is greater, the risk that you take is greater in some fields. I guess if you study engineering, it's a pretty safe bet. If you study, some other fields, there's more variability, but it is actually interesting that overall field of study mismatch was much less associated with wage differences than the level of skills that people have. No?
Thank you, Andreas. And we've got a really interesting question here from Paul, who says the survey shows that literacy has stagnated and numeracy has improved. But has numeracy caught up with literacy since the last survey?
Well, it's very hard to compare to different subjects. You can only look at this in relative terms. And what you can see very clearly is that the numeracy skills of the young people have actually, shifted the distribution upwards in England. And that's, I think, something the education system has clearly been the main contributor to. We have seen less improvement among adults. Now, Sweden would be the opposite. You can say the improvement in Sweden has been to a large extent driven actually by older generations advancing the numeracy skills, whereas in England that's not been true. So you can say that young people in England have become better in numeracy and get closer to the average, and not yet quite there for the older generation. I think the gap is as it was, basically.
Great, thank you. We've got time for a few more. I'm going to go to Philida's question next. So she says, we know that while overall children from migrant backgrounds appear to do better than their first language peers, low-level English language skills do in fact affect their educational performance negatively. So here we're talking, I think Philida means it depends on their English language proficiency, which is absolutely right. Could the same be true for adult migrants?
Yeah, I'm sure that's an effect. This is a test that doesn't really measure reading, it measures reading English. And so if some of the people who do not come out, migrants who do not come out very well on this test might very well read in their native language. But that's what we looked at, basically the language skills they will need to use in the British labor market. But what I find interesting, is that the gap in Britain is not as large as it is in many other countries. So I think you can't, I mean, migration is not the main driver of the differences in performance that you can see. Is a lot more about social background. Plus, in the second generation, it has completely disappeared. No, I think you cannot say that just children of migrants in Britain read less well than their native counterparts. No?
Yeah, I thought the fact that the gap disappears within a generation was fascinating and really aligns with some of our own research on EPI that shows that what matters is proficiency and length of time in England. So how long a child has been here matters more. Great. Interesting question next from Anne, who asked whether it's possible to make any comparisons with England's performance in PISA, acknowledging that this is a different assessment and age group, etc.
Yeah, if you look at the young population in this survey and the PISA results, you find some, coincidence, they're correlated, but it's very hard to make, these are really different kind of age groups. And what we actually did is we looked at the PIAAC age group that used to be the PISA group a decade ago, and then make those comparisons. And broadly, I would say they align for most countries. For some not, we have seen in Norway and Denmark and Sweden, the PIAAC results. In Finland, the PIAAC results are much better than the PISA results. To some extent, that could be actually more effective adult learning in those systems. But we do not know. We can just see that there are some countries where they're not well aligned. But in the case of England, I think it's pretty close.
Thank you, Andreas. We'll just take a couple more before we move on to our panel. So Helen asks, what type of skills are included in adaptive problem solving? And she's particularly interested in people's research skills.
Well, since we test the whole adult population, we're not, you can't stretch the distribution too far. So this is really quite basic problem solving skills. We give people, you have to move from point A to B through point C. Can you optimize your kind of travel? And it's very much, everyday kind of problems in a digital kind of environment. And you have to use basic digital tools to, figure out, practical solutions to things. We did not get into, if you would test research skills, you would probably find, just very, very kind of low performance. I mean, I must tell you, when you read those results, for many of the problems, you ask yourself, how could anyone get those things wrong? But we tend to overestimate, what people around us can do. I mean, it's difficult when you come from a highly educated environment. It's difficult to imagine sort of the skill levels of big part of the particularly problem solving. Most of the tasks that we gave actually were far too difficult. If we had given research kind of related tasks, you'd probably see, a very small share of adults comfortable with that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I'm going to take one final question from Noni, but in the meantime, David has asked a question about sampling. But David, I think you can find the information on the OECD report link that we've circulated. So final question from Noni is, we often say in the UK that we have a skills gap, by which people don't mean soft skills or literacy or numeracy, but training in specific disciplines where we need more recruits, for example, construction, IT, healthcare. Does the lack of impact from field of study on earnings imply this mismatch doesn't matter so much, or is that an overinterpretation?
It's a very good question. Success in every work, it's a mix of, generic skills, the things that we measure here, and job-specific qualifications and experience. And we just do not know that other part. We have only measured those kind of transversal skills. But the fact that they do explain a good part of the wage distribution suggests that actually transversal skills are really, really important. And later this year, when we add the more social emotional outcomes, the workplace skills, you're going to see that share increasing. But I'm absolutely sure that job-specific kind of experience and qualifications will add quite a bit to that. It's just much harder to capture in those kinds of surveys.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. I'm going to draw the this part of the Q&A to a close now and move on to our expert panel. So they should all appear on your screen in a moment. But joining Andreas and Dame Athene on the panel, we also have Anna Dorr, who is principal of Wigan and Lee College. We have Stephen Main, who is strategy lead for adult essential skills in the DFE. And Stephen, we've already got a question lined up for you. And last but not least, we have David Robinson, who is director of post-16 and skills here in EPI. So a very warm welcome to our panel. I'm going to give each of them a couple of minutes to make some opening remarks and reflections on the findings from the PIAAC study, and particularly thinking about the implications for policy. So Dame Athene, we'll start with you, if that's okay.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation, and it's quite hard to take in all the different points. I was trying to think what are my 2 points, sort of thing. One thing I think as a country we really need to worry about are the huge number of working age adults with low basic skills. I mean, although the gap has increased, that the most successful are doing better, but we still have this sort of 20% of the population. It's many millions who don't have good proficiency in the absolutely basic skills, and I think that's something we really should be worrying about. Is it we need to do more with lifelong learning? Is it that something is going wrong in our school system so that we are failing a number of a substantial number of our children? The other thing that, to come back to, are people overqualified? If you were following the chat, there was a point that saying that's a dodgy kind of ideological statement to make, and we should worry about it. I think I would frame it rather as, are we pushing people in the wrong directions so that they are getting qualifications that they are not then really able to utilize very well? And it comes back to, do we need more people who are doing perhaps sub-degree qualifications, vocational stuff? And again, I think I would go back to one of the remarks I made right at the beginning, which is, what is our education for? And are we so set on sort of A-level gold standard that as a nation, and it's obviously England, not the rest of the devolved nation, are we concentrating too much on a certain trajectory and not thinking hard enough about what really works for all these other, the other 50% of the population?
Yeah, really interesting questions falling out of that, Dame Athene. Thank you so much. Anna, a very warm welcome to you, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Natalie, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this discussion this afternoon. It's been just so interesting to see those slides from Andreas and hear Athene's comments earlier, which I really do agree. I think the timing of the PIAAC is really important actually at the moment, because it comes when we are doing a significant curriculum review. And as providers, we are at a bit of a crossroads in terms of where we are taking our curriculum and awaiting many, many outcomes from the DfE and from government. But of course, the real question is, how does this report inform our policy moving forward for our young adults and our young people in the next 10 years? And interestingly, since COVID, I think we are, as providers, seeing a significant shift. And as a country, as a society, we valued qualifications over skills for far too long. And I would always argue that both are absolutely essential. But skills are beginning to find their voice. And actually, since COVID, what we've found is the disruption of such an event on the ground is showing that our young people and our learners are beginning to reject the overly academic qualification-driven offer that we seem to offer through our school, through the national curriculum, and at post-16 and beyond. And we are seeing, and I think it'll be interesting in 10 years' time, because we are seeing higher rates of school refusal. We're seeing increases in the number of elected home educated, a decline in school attendance. NEET figures have remained stubbornly consistent. They are not reducing. But we're also seeing a lot of young people not automatically seeing university as their next valued step in terms of their learning. So I think there is a real opportunity to do something different. I hope the curriculum reform review will be brave enough. I know Dame Athene's opening comments, and I agree. I think we may not see the boldness that we really truly need, but I hope it is the beginning, because I think the cohort of young people who will be the next 10 years of the next PIAAC, I think that they will be a very, very different cohort. And I think what they need and what they want in terms of engagement with education and skills will actually require something very, very different indeed. I think there are some promising signs. I think we are seeing through some of the reformed technical education in T levels and some of the newer standards through apprenticeships, we're seeing a broader skills attainment around that curriculum. And I think that that is absolutely crucial. Problem solving in the workplace, prompting that maturity, that independence of thought. We're beginning to see those signs, and it is really producing some incredibly positive outcomes, but it isn't yet at scale. And it, of course, hits up against a national curriculum that by no means is on its way to meeting that at the moment. And I think as well, the argument around the missing middle of level 4 and 5 technical skills, they're still there. They're still there in engineering. They're still there in construction. A lot of our employers still prefer those pathways, but they're not readily understood. And at this moment, they are not readily accessible. So I think there are many, many challenges. And the final challenge for me, I think, is the importance of lifelong learning, the importance of investment in our adults, both in the workplace and those furthest away. We know that they are then hugely influential on their own families and young people around their success in education and engagement as well. And of course, we're now facing further cuts in adult education and training yet again. And that, I think, is a concern for the next 10 years. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Anna, and lots of challenges for us to pick up from there. Again, if you do have any questions for our panel, please start getting them into the Q&A box in at the bottom of your screen. Right, we'll hear next from Stephen Main, who is Strategy Lead for Adult Essential Skills at the DfE. A very warm welcome to you, Stephen. And I wonder whether I might ask in your opening remarks if you could also address the question we had earlier about whether some of these findings are being fed into Becky's curriculum and assessment review.
Great. Thank you, Natalie, for the invite today. Let me first just start by saying that, as Natalie said, I work on adult essential skills in the Department for Education. So my focus is very much on the lower levels of literacy and numeracy and what we can do to push those up higher. However, this report, pretty much every part of it is relevant to somewhere in the Department for Education. This is the best resource we have on literacy and numeracy. We take it very seriously. Baroness Smith, the Skills Minister, was at and indeed spoke at the launch event in December for the overall OECD report. Large parts of the department have been working closely with the production of the separate national report that I put a link in the chat to, and I think will be shared afterwards. We also, I'm pretty sure if you look up large amounts of public comments and parliamentary question responses and anything like that over the last 10 years, you'll find some figure from the previous reports, particularly the 9 million figure on the numbers that had low literacy, numeracy, or both quoted. So right up until I think it's even in the Skills England report that was published in September. So we continued to use that right up until we got new data. It is absolutely fantastic to have new data. And then I think in terms of what we're taking from the headlines, I mean, one is that we've got to be careful not to only focus on the headlines. It gives us really helpful sort of snapshots. The fact that 9 million figure is still 8.5, technically it's gone down, but not by anywhere near enough. I mean, that's still 8.5 million people that we need to be doing more to help. Also, I think there's a danger with international comparisons, that they're really useful. They tell us a lot. The danger is in the interpretation, that you can look at this and start to declare a victory because we've gone up or down against someone in a table. Now, there's lots of different reasons behind that, and I'm picking some of those we'll probably get onto in the panel. But at the core of all of this is, in lots of ways, it doesn't matter for the individuals. If we've improved with our overall literacy and numeracy scores, that doesn't necessarily help the person, or it doesn't in fact in any way help the individual whose literacy or numeracy levels have not improved. So just because we've seen improvements, it points in a direction that we should be continuing to go potentially, but by no means does that mean that we're there. Also, I think there's a danger that we start trying to solve the problems of the last 10 years, potentially. So we'll look at some of the findings, what the findings are really helpful for, drawing out areas that I'll give an example. So if we look at the difference in levels of individuals born inside and outside the UK, the information that Andreas pointed to, that it doesn't seem to have had a massive impact on the overall numbers, that is useful to draw. But if the makeup of the individuals arriving is changing, then we don't want to just sit back and wait for another report in 10 years and say, well, it's not an issue because actually it's okay. And I came straight from a conversation with providers on ESOL actually before this, who were saying the makeup is changing. It is lots of people with lower levels of literacy coming in at the moment that they're seeing, and we're also at record numbers, I think, well, not record, but highest numbers in over a decade studying English for speakers of other languages provision. But I just wanted to point to a couple of other areas that I think jump out to me and that I'm particularly interested in looking at. One is the increase in the levels for 16 to 24-year-olds. As has been pointed out, we were outliers. We're not outliers anymore. That's great. A lot of policy focus has gone into that. You could draw some clear inferences on that. It's not necessarily the direct result of some of those policy changes. I think digging into that deeper is something that we'll want to be doing as well, to understand what has worked, what hasn't worked, and how can we keep pushing forward on that. The things that really stand out to me, though, particularly looking at the adult space, are the regional disparities. They haven't really changed, and we've made some changes to the system, so it'll be interesting to see if the devolution of the Adult Skills Fund makes any difference in that space. The socioeconomic gap not widening sounds good, but it's also not closing, so that's not exactly a win, really, I think, there, and again, is something to focus on. And there's been a lot of talk about the skills mismatches. Now, some of this falls out of my direct area, but I find it very interesting. I think there's a lot to unpick in that as to what it means, where it's a problem, and there's so many comments already I've seen which are fascinating, and it'd be good to talk a bit more about this. But I think, though, that's a really interesting area that as a department we'll want to look at a bit more. And before I wrap up, just in response to the question, I can't say for certain exactly what's been passed on to Becky Francis or not. I can say that this information is well known around the department. It has been shared at senior level around the department, particularly in the skills group. I know that because I sent it around myself. But the minister is well aware of this. Senior members of staff take this very seriously. So I can certainly check to make sure that the team has shared any findings that we've got internally on this. But it's not. This is certainly not the first time we've come across this report. We've been heavily involved throughout. So I'll double check on that, but we are aware, and we'll be using this, I think, for our policy development for the next decade. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And finally, over to you, David.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks, Andreas, for your presentation. So when I first saw these results, I was actually quite baffled. I think the results for literacy for young people, quite as expected for me, no real significant change. I was not expecting to see numeracy improvements for young people in this round of PIAAC. Then I thought a bit more about the context. Well, actually, the reason I hadn't been expecting to see these improvements was over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a 2/3 fall in funding for classroom-based adult learning. We've seen similar size falls in the number of adult literacy and numeracy qualifications. And although we had the introduction of the resit policy for those not passing or not getting good pass in English and maths at age 16, we've only seen fairly marginal improvements in results since then. But then thinking a bit deeper, I thought, well, what could be some of the drivers here? Firstly, we've seen huge increases in the proportion of young people taking A-level maths. That number is something like doubled in the last 20 years. So that definitely could be playing a part here. And although the resit, improvement in resits has been fairly marginal over the last 10 years, previous to that, they were quite significant. In the 10 years prior to the resit policy being introduced in 2014, there were quite big increases. So perhaps these are some of the factors driving the improvements that we've seen. Coming back to, I think someone asked about the relationship between the PIAAC results for young people and the PISA results. I did my own back of the envelope analysis for this, probably not quite as thorough as Andreas's no doubt will have been. But I found actually for countries with similar PISA results, the results for 16 to 24-year-olds in England around about average. So our sort of very proxy value added for that phase is just average at the moment. So we perhaps shouldn't get too excited. So I think, there have been improvements for those who've studied A-levels and the small number that's benefited from resitting. But we should still note that there are a large proportion of young people who stop study of numeracy and literacy at age 16. And I think the curriculum review should still be looking at the breadth of study in the 16 to 19 phase, and whether or not that should continue study of English and maths for all young people. One final point is it's really easy to get caught up in talk about qualifications, as I just have. I think we also need to think about workforce who are delivering this education, and in particular in the FE sector, we know that recruitment and retention is very, very difficult. Pay levels are lower. Funding has been cut over the last decade or so, and so we need to focus on who is delivering this education alongside what kinds of qualifications are being delivered.
Great. Thank you for that, David. And actually, before I move on to the audience questions, and again, a reminder, do pop your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. But I might come back to you, Anna, on that final point that David mentioned about the further education workforce. How much of a challenge is that to you? And what do you think the government, what are the levers that the government has here to improve things?
Thank you. One of the biggest challenges the FE sector has at the moment is actually securing the workforce to deliver not only current skills, but the skills of tomorrow. So we are not only struggling to recruit in maths and English for resits and non-resits, but literacy and numeracy. And we, of course, are struggling to recruit those essential skills in areas like health, engineering and construction. The reasons for that are multifaceted, but I would surmise that the main one is that an FE lecturer, though having to be a qualified teacher, have a degree, and in many cases higher degrees, is paid on average £10,000 less than a school teacher. And there are many ways that you can dress that up. Unfortunately, that one fact is unavoidable. The FE sector has become incredibly inventive and incredibly resilient in not only recruiting staff, finding ways to work with vocational staff and train them up, and to retain staff, and are doing an incredible job. But there is a reality that position is not sustainable. And I think when we're talking about growth and productivity, and we're talking about changes in jobs for the future, and, you know, the green agenda and all of those things, it's very much in the FE space that those issues will be addressed, will be delivered. So there has to be some policy support around this. It isn't just pay, though pay, I'm afraid, is very much an overriding issue. But we do need very, very quick solutions if we are going to respond to the growth agenda with the workforce that we need. Yeah.
Thank you, Anna. I'll move on to the audience questions now, and do keep them coming for the next 15 to 20 minutes. We have a question for Michelle and David. I might put this to you first and then move on to our other panelists. So thinking about the breadth and the decline in uptake of art thinking about the breadth and the decline in uptake of art subjects post-16 and the increase in STEM, is it likely that this also creates a mismatch later on and contributes to potential overqualification? So David, I'll come to you first, and then to Andreas, and then Athene.
I think broadly, yes. I mean, you could also say the same, I think, for more vocationally orientated study. You know, young people are forced largely to choose between an academic pathway and vocational qualifications at 16. That's not totally true. You know, some young people, an increasing proportion, do a mix, but certainly the T-levels policy was pushing towards quite a binary choice. Our own research shows that those students who do a mix of types of subjects, say more creative arts subjects mixed with sciences, or maths mixed with language, students who do a larger variation of subjects do on average go on to better labour market outcomes in their mid-20s. So I think certainly the structure of our 16 to 19 system does push young people into rather narrow pathways, certainly by comparison to a lot of the other OECD countries we've seen results for here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And worth saying that research that you referred to just now, David, was very kindly supported by the Royal Society. So thank you again for supporting this very important area of breadth of curriculum. Andreas, I'll come to you on that same question, and then to Athene.
Yes, I think, you know, that is generally true that in England you have to make choices quite soon. You know, I think that all of this debate about mathematics and numeracy in most countries, it's normal that you study mathematics up to the age of 18. And I think the whole GCSE, that actually at age 15 you have to make quite some fundamental choices, that the A-levels then become already with a high degree of specialization. That is in the world of today quite unique. Even countries, you know, like my own, where route to vocational education begins earlier, at least a big part of that vocational education is actually transversal in nature. So a lot of the, you know, vocational education in Switzerland, in Germany, would contain a lot of elements that you would classify as academic or generic in the UK. So I think, and we don't have, consistent data on this, but I think the hypothesis that the breadth of skills, particularly in a kind of volatile labor market, is an advantage. I think certainly holds.
Thank you, Andreas. And Dame Matheny, interested in your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, I would certainly agree that the specialisation that England goes in for incredibly young is really damaging, because you have to make choices before you're really in a position to make a sensible choice, and you may well find you've taken the wrong route. I think that applies pre-16, but it obviously also applies post-16. We briefly had the AS system for those who were going on to do A levels, which was meant to encourage breadth, but that faltered as a system. I think there's another point that turned up in one of the Q&A, and that's about gender, that a lot of girls at 16 may want to keep an art subject and a science subject going. The schools find that, the schools allow that to happen, and then it is hard for a girl perhaps to go on to a STEM career because they haven't got the right set of choices. We are incredibly restrictive, if you like, in what we do. And we know that the modern workplace needs a lot of different skills. I'm a physicist, and I would say physics is immensely creative, but a lot of people don't see the sciences as being creative and want to do a creative subject. So we, I think, really do need to think hard about what a post-16 education should be like. Now, all of that I've talked about in the context of those who are going on to do A levels, but to some extent it applies just as much if you're not. You need that breadth. You need to be able to write, you need to be able to analyze, and you need to be able to enumerate. And that, that's exactly what this study is exploring. And by and large, we let some of our children down by not making that a straightforward path to take.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. I'll move us on to the next question, which I think is really challenging one. From Johnny, he says the main driver for post-compulsory education provision in England is student choice rather than labour market needs, i.e. the funding follows what students choose to do rather than on skill shortages. And then Johnny asks, how could we align these better? But I might also broaden that question to say, should we be aligning these better? And I will come to Stephen first on this one.
Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, it's a difficult one as to how could we align these better. I think what I've certainly seen is that there is a gap between the skills that we think employers need and the skills that are articulated from employers, and it's unclear probably where we're going wrong on that at the moment, or exactly how we go about filling that. I think that is what a lot of the priorities of the government are focusing on, and hopefully we'll see more coming out soon as further plans develop. But sort of to come to the qualification point, I suppose we often sort of, is a GCSE giving you the skills you need, or is it giving you a quick pointer to an employer that you might have those skills and they don't need to have to dig any deeper into it? So we funnel everyone to do GCSEs, we funnel everyone to have English and maths. That can be a blocker to go into further progress. That element applies even sort of the student choice point that we've made. So even where students are trying to choose to do something else, quite often they will have to have had that English or maths GCSE to move on to that. And there's quite a lot of complaints that that's unfair and is blocking people's skills. Now we do that because we think these are the foundational skills people need that will allow them to achieve things more broadly later on in their career. So we do face that tension already in this small area. If we widen that out more broadly, is that going to help students? I don't know. I think is probably the honest answer on that. I would be interested in discussing it more, though. I think how we manage to match people up to the labour market is the key challenge we face in a country with really low productivity that is holding us back. We are looking at solutions at this moment. I don't think anyone's hit upon the golden solution, but I yeah, I think that is probably the key question that we've got. If I had the answer now, I would love to take it back and solve this problem. But right now, I don't, other than to say that we are sort of poring over this data and thinking through how we take it forward.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to come to you next, Anna, on this question of whether and how we should be better aligning student choice with labour market needs. And then after we've heard from you, Anna, I'm going to come back to Andreas on thoughts of whether there are other countries that do this more proactively. But first, Anna, interested in your thoughts.
Thank you. One of the debates I think that we have an awful lot in education is, are we educators or are we here to produce economic outcomes? And the reality is we're here to do both, aren't we? First and foremost, as a college, I believe that my role is to educate our young people, but educate them in a way that they can fulfill their dreams, their aspirations, whatever they may be. And I think one of the things we have to accept is those are going to change over their lifetime. So I think we spend a lot of time focusing on getting 16-year-olds to choose areas that actually we think are a skills priority. Sometimes maybe we ought to put some of that focus more on how we upskill adults in the workplace so that they can actually make some of those shifts into those priority areas as well. And I don't think that we do that well enough as through our funding and as a society. I don't think we value that lifelong learning, because I think that is equally as important. I think the other thing is that we underestimate our young people and our young adults if we think that we can steer them without actually just giving them the tools to make their own choices. We've all done initiatives around females into STEM subjects, male students into nursing subjects, and we literally just begin to maybe touch the edges. We don't make or bring about phenomenal change. I think we need to ensure that our young people throughout their compulsory schooling are better informed as to the range of careers and pathways that are open to them, that they, through a national curriculum, get to explore a wider skills base rather than just academic learning, so that they begin to recognise within themselves what actually they are good at, but also what they really enjoy. And it is amazing that when young people are exposed to those opportunities, how they do find their way to a wider variety of subjects, and subjects they never thought they would do. And if we give them LMI data and we let them see what their potential earnings can be, what their job security can be, what the variety is in some of the pathways they've taken, I think it would open their eyes to a much greater choice that they would understand. And you would begin by that to secure, I think, a broader progression choice from our young people across the piece. It isn't the golden bullet, I'm afraid. I haven't got one, but it is an attempt.
Yeah, Anna, I was just saying, I don't think anyone has a golden bullet as such. But Andreas, are there other countries that are doing this more proactively and potentially better?
Yeah, I think it's an issue everywhere, because the evolution of labor demand is such that it's actually very, very hard for any school systems to anticipate it. And but I think we need to be conscious that the student choice is clearly a potential social stratifier. That's what you can see across the world. The more choice students have, the more likely that is routing people, in those destinations based on their social background. So the question is how you mitigate this. And this is, I think, an area where many countries put great effort, which means helping young people make good choices for them rather than just being guided by, what they see on television. And we see that actually too many young people make choices based on very partial information. Children from disadvantaged backgrounds have a very myopic view on the labor market. Children from wealthy backgrounds know the world. And those things do make a difference when you make choices. I think, so that's the first part, I think really good, the more children have labor market experience early on, and I mean even primary school, there's very good evidence that actually that's the age where many of those kind of perceptions about the utility of school subjects are being formed, the more I think, and that's something that is happening in many countries. So good guidance, good kind of career. The other part, often we group people unconsciously by the way we design school subjects. Why does every Chinese kid love mathematics? And why we have so many kids in Europe or UK who say, I'm not good in math, or I'm not, talented, or I can't succeed in math. It's a lot to do with the way we teach those subjects. We have, or I mean, everybody knows that the labor market requires STEM, and then you have, shortage of people going into STEM. Why? Because the first thing we do in school is we take the T out, and then we take the E out, the technology and the engineering. And this is exactly what makes those subjects interesting. And we keep the S and we keep the M, which is about equations and formulas. And then, we drive a lot of young people out of things that actually are incredibly important for our society. So I think this is the second part, making sure that what people learn. I agree so much that, I'm a graduate of physics as well. And I actually think those subjects can be incredibly creative. They can be fascinating, but we make them geared to only one profile of people. As I said before, I like the idea to make mathematics up to the age of 15, but don't make it compulsory, make it interesting, and I think we miss that the choices of young people often are geared towards this. So, but, and I very much agree with Anna, I think we should have, an approach of dual degrees, give young people good information on where they can earn a great living, and then at the same time let them pursue something they have a real interest in. And sometimes it's the intersection that will open up the next job.
Thank you, Andreas. And just because this is a really interesting question about student choice and labour market demand, I will also come to Dame Athene and then to David finally on this question.
Well, the answer, I would come back to Stephen and say one of the crucial things is there isn't enough join up between what the Department for Education is able to do and the other government departments. The opportunity mission ought to be an opportunity literally to try and pull that together. When I read the Industrial Strategy Green Paper, it had skills as the sort of top of the list of the barriers to sorting out productivity. I don't want to get utilitarian, but just to make a specific point, it had that as the top of the list, but it said remarkably little thereafter in the rest of the paper. I think it isn't just a case of DFE being able to resolve this. I'm sure there isn't a golden bullet, but I think it is a case of trying to make sure that different parts of the system join together. And I think that applies just as much if one's looking at university, FE and schools. I think all these parts have to join together. And at the moment we have universities sort of sitting in one part of the ecosystem, as it were, and FE in another. And I think there is insufficient sort of join up in policy to make things at all viable in this space, if you like. So it's not about empowering our young people only, it's making sort of policy decisions that join up the dots. I feel extremely strongly about this.
Thank you. And David, finally from you on this question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Let's take a slightly different tack on this. I don't think that the main driver for post-compulsory education provision is student choice. I think it's the grades that students get at the end of compulsory education. That is the main, so it's not necessarily a choice. And one of the things that concerns me around what happens for young people at that critical juncture is we know that funding for disadvantaged students drops by about a third between the ages of 16 and post-16 education. So the very point at which students are having to make critical decisions and then getting their A-level results or other qualification results, we see this fall in funding that then causes disparities in terms of progression to university or other higher education providers. So for me, I think focusing in on reducing those inequalities at 16 and in post-16 education, crucial to what happens next.
Yeah, that's a really important take on it as well, David. Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our time in the webinar this afternoon. Andreas, we have a question here on asking, what are the results for literacy and numeracy by gender, and how do they compare to GCSE results for English and maths? I'm not expecting you to do the GCSE comparison, but if you could give us an overview, if you can, on what PIAAC tells us about gender, then we might take it from there with the panel.
Yeah, gender gaps are much smaller than socioeconomic gaps in general. What you can see in numeracy, men have a somewhat advantage over women, and for younger men, it's a little bit smaller. For literacy, it switches the other way around, which is actually interesting. 10 years ago, it was not the case, but there is now a slight advantage for women, and adaptive problem solving is somewhere in the middle, with men having a slight advantage. But honestly, the gender gap is small compared to many of the other differences that we discuss here.
Thank you so much. And does any of our panel want to come in? If you could just raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have thoughts. David first.
Thanks, Natalie. So from what I can see in the PIAAC results, for young women, the results have gone down slightly, and for young men, the results have gone up slightly, which does actually mirror some of what we've seen in GCSE results, where we've seen the gender gap closing largely as a result of improvements for boys and deterioration for girls. I think although girls GCSE on average still get high GCSEs, I think there are legitimate questions to be asked about what is driving this sudden fall in results for young women. We know over sort of similar time periods that there's been a huge increase in the prevalence of girls reporting poor mental health. And for me, that's something that we should be looking in more detail at, see whether there's a correlation between this increase in poor mental health and falling academic results at the same time. Certainly need to understand the area a bit better.
Yeah, really good point, David. Thank you. Stephen, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. It's actually, if the OECD scores themselves, I've got the gender ones in front of me from the England National Report, and while sort of on the bigger scale, they're not necessarily massively different. There are still some noticeable gaps by gender for numeracy, but not for literacy in the UK. Now that is true across the OECD, but the gap is bigger in England than it is for the OECD average. That is not true for literacy, where the gap between men and women is actually very similar in England. So I think that's something that jumps out as initial headline, but there are lots of caveats that come with that, in that is it gender that's driving that gap? Because there's lots of other things that could be, if you start to, you sort of need to look at the comparisons by, and this is where the PIAAC report's really interesting, where you have lots of socioeconomic data, but there's ethnic group, there's age, there's educational attainment, there's parental educational attainment, there's lots of different things to dig into. So there is a gender gap that we see, but whether or not that means that it is purely based on gender, I think is something that we'll want to look into a bit further. And we are thinking about sort of next steps of research on that, because this data gives us that resource to be able to see if we can pinpoint where exactly the scores are not even.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Any other panelists want to come in on the point about gender gaps? Okay, Anna, I might give you the right to reply on this final question in the Q&A box from Felida. We know from educational research that the skills of the teachers are key to the progress that learners make. I'm concerned that further education teachers have not had the training to teach English and maths as well as they could. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are they are equally qualified. They have a degree in their chosen subject. They do work with colleagues in schools. They go through the same awarding body, staff development events. And it's strange, actually, because I've even had people say to me that FE teachers, because every single student they teach is an examined student, it's obvious often in schools, some teachers aren't teaching in years 10 and 11. So I don't think that that is an issue in my experience in my own college and in the sector. I think what is more of an issue is doing GCSE resits as part of a full level 2 or full level 3 course. So the hours are severely limited to what they would have done in school. Young people who've already failed, not wanting to re-engage with something they've spent so long doing and not being successful with. And I think in addition to that, we've got the bell curve marking system, and we don't have a set standard that allows a young person to meet a standard and pass, rather they have to compete within their own cohort. And that, I think, is more of an issue around why we aren't getting the results at resits that we really wish we could get. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming back on that that challenge, Anna. And thank you to all our panelists and speakers today, to particularly to Andreas and the OECD for their fantastic insights into the report that they produced, to Dame Matheny and colleagues at the Royal Society for their insights and for supporting today's webinar, and to our panelists, Anna, Stephen and David, for your insights. Thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions. Do keep in touch with the work here in EPI. You can look us up on our website, epi.org.uk, or follow us on Blue Sky and X if you are on either of those platforms. And do get in touch and leave us any feedback on this event too. But otherwise, thank you so much, and do have a great rest of the week. Bye.